Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Hillary. I think that having Pew here and Route 50 here is a great compliment, and could not be more grateful. And I know you're going to get a chance to hear Bob Rankin and Casey Becker, two of our best representatives, Secretary of State Wayne Williams. We are blessed in Colorado, as you note, with great legislators. Also, History Colorado, this building, I am particularly proud of. I think it really has turned out to be a beautiful building and has kind of reinvigorated people's approach to not just history, but to facts. And the story I always tell, you know, I got into politics. Really, I ran for mayor of Denver in 2003 after spending about a year and a half looking at, you know, the three things I asked again and again. Actually, Mayor Tom Menino in Boston, Tom's from Boston, was one of the key people that I talked to in this kind of search. A, can you make a difference? B, would I be any good at it? And C, would I like it enough to really immerse myself in it? And as I went around the country over almost 2 years, I got more and more excited about it. And part of this was seeing what originally it started with Bill Bratton, who was when he was police commissioner in New York City, and he started something called Crime Stat, and they would measure where a crime happened all over the metropolitan New York, and then they would reallocate using maps their police staff to those places where they had crime. What a concept, right? Martin O'Malley was at that time just coming in as mayor of, or just been elected mayor of Baltimore. He'd been in office for a couple of years, and we went down there and saw he was taking that notion of Crime Stat and he called it City Stat, and he was measuring and mapping everything. It's not just about having the facts, but it's finding creative ways to use those facts in fresh ways, and to imaging, mapping, those kinds of tools become incredibly powerful. But my favorite story is, you know, I ran for mayor. You know, I never ran for student council. I mean, I had no connection to politics. Wouldn't do a negative ad. Just talked about how we were going to, you know, bring a different way to government. We were going to look at, you know, really using facts and basic core principles of common sense to run the city. And you know, somehow, I'm not sure exactly how it happened. I'm not sure how I got talked into running, really. But we won 2-1, got reelected with 87% of the vote, always talking about, you know, let's use these basic tenets of common sense. Let's look at what the facts are. Let's get the affected parties together in the same place, and then let's figure out what the solution is to the problem. What are we really trying to solve for? We used that same principle when I ran for governor. And again, I'm the first mayor of Denver since the beginning of the state, so 120 years to get elected governor, just because the partisan divides were so deeply entrenched across the state. The city of Denver historically hated the suburbs, and the suburbs would always side with the rural areas, so anybody from Denver was doomed. And when I came in as mayor, I said, all right, well, if we're really going to use the facts, let's look at them in a fresh way. And look at the fact that some of our suburban neighbors are using groundwater, and we can see that groundwater, and we can actually map how rapidly they are depleting their reservoir, their capacity. And of course, when I talk about these facts to Denver residents, they'd say, well, you know, those suburbs ringed us in, they wouldn't let us grow by accreting. Their time will come when they run out of water. And basic fact, their time was going to come. And I'd point out to those, we used to call them water buffaloes, some of the old civic leaders of the city and county of Denver. I said, well, you know, if Douglas County to the south or Aurora to the east, if they run out of water and they suspend building permits for a couple of years, that's going to affect the value of every person's home in Denver. It's not just going to affect those communities, it's going to affect the whole metropolitan area. And they scratch their head and go, huh, that's interesting. When we first addressed gun safety, and this is I mean, even when you spend a decade working on trying to use facts and making sure you have your facts, I think a key part of success is constantly looking for, have I got the right facts? And am I using them in an objective, responsible fashion? We had the shooting at the movie theater in Aurora, 70 people shot. Big, push back around any kind of gun safety. And people forget we put in $30 million of funding for mental health, clearly responsive to that. But we also looked at things like universal background checks. Saw the statistics nationally that this was a big issue. At that time, Colorado was only doing background checks on about half the gun purchases. And as soon as we brought it into the legislature, you know, all heck broke loose. All hell broke loose. I mean, it was a real challenge. And what happened, you know, we were just getting beat up every day because every Republican who I knew, who I asked for advice, would say, well, of course, I believe in universal background checks. Let's make sure dangerous people don't have guns. But all the elected Republicans were adamant against it for various political reasons. And they said, well, crooks aren't stupid. Why are we all having to pay $10 and wait for 15 minutes to get a firearm? So I came home one time. At that time, my son, Teddy, was 11 years old, and he'd had a bad day, and I made the mistake of complaining about this. And Teddy looked at me and says, Dad, give me a break. What do you do all day at work that's so hard? Make decisions? He goes, Daddy, get the facts, make a decision, check, next. I said, Teddy, well, it's not that. He goes, Daddy, get the facts, make a decision, check, next. Every day I've got to go into school and learn something completely new I didn't know existed the day before. And if I don't get it exactly right, my next day is misery because everything's based on the day before. You know, after 10 minutes, I said, Teddy, you're right. 5th grade is harder than being governor. But I came in the next morning and I said, you know, we did get all the national facts on background checks, but we didn't check in Colorado what kind of success we had with the background checks we were doing. So I instructed the Department of Public Safety. It took them several weeks to go and gather up of the 50% of gun purchases that were getting background checks. Did we catch anybody? Well, you can judge because I memorized the statistics. 38 people, this is in 2012, half the gun purchases. 38 people convicted of homicide tried to buy a gun and we stopped them. 133 people convicted of sexual assault. 1,100 people convicted of felony assault, where someone usually goes to the hospital. There were 420 people that had a judicial restraining order saying that they shouldn't see their ex-spouse or their ex-boss. They tried to buy a gun and we stopped them. And just in case you don't really think crooks are stupid, 238 individuals, when they came to pick up their gun, we arrested them for an outstanding warrant for a violent crime. And I think, yeah. But by the time we got those facts, the battle lines had been drawn and we'd missed that opportunity. And I think it's a wonderful example of, you know, just having a set of facts isn't enough. What you need is the facts that are most directly applicable to the issue at hand, and by directly applicable, I mean as close as possible geographically confluent, right? That they are the facts from the people that are going to be most gracefully or definitely affected. And a big part of this is making sure you have integrated systems, that when you're making decisions around facts, you are able to get the facts from one agency to another quickly, and that your silos aren't blocking the cross-collateralization of information. One thing we focused on a lot at the state level is in getting the better results for our customers, our residents. The SMART Act, which was, let me get this right, the state measurement for accountable, responsive, and transparent government that requires our departments to create a performance plan that outlines their top 5 goals, but we track the data getting to that goal, put dashboards. It's, you know, all part of this, what we call SMART Act reporting, but it's online. And each agency, in many cases, has an integration requirement that their information, part of their success is working with other agencies. We also utilize a performance management program to make sure that in issues like healthcare and economic development and workforce, we are constantly collecting the information that is most relevant. We've embraced the lean programs. Starts with, you know, our customer-facing state employees, right? The folks that are dealing with the public, making sure that we get their insights, what they think are the problems, and in true lean process. Most of you know lean, it came originally from Toyota. Business, kind of a continuous improvement approach, very, very focused and very successful. We've now gone through over 400 lean projects in the state. We've trained over 3,000 people of our state workforce in lean process. And I think saves thousands and tens of thousands of hours for the customers of the state and saved millions of dollars of taxpayer money. Kind of a classic example there. Our performance management accounting has been training top leaders not just in lean but in this kind of fact-based approach to make sure that they understand lean principles, but also recognize that part of lean is not just getting a new software system, but it's reevaluating the way you go about doing your business at every level. We also partnered with MacArthur Foundation and Pew on the Results First initiative, making sure that we had innovative cost-benefit analysis before we rolled out major initiatives. Part of this is making sure you have trials and templates. I think one of the more successful efforts, we approached teenage pregnancy, which obviously is a challenge statistically, the costs and really the misery that's created when low-income women and men, when a couple's not ready to start a family and the woman gets pregnant, so often that teenage child or the teenage mother, that's not her first child. Statistically, again and again, more than half teenage mothers will have a second child before they leave their teenage years. We got foundation funding to make sure if we provided to every low-income woman who asked for it, and again, in the modern world, we were very clear saying if you're a teenager, you shouldn't be having sex. That's the first response to every single client that came into any of our 29 clinics and healthcare centers across the state. But if they asked for it, we would give them long-acting reversible contraception, right? Norplants, IUDs. And in the space of about 4 years, we were spending about $5 million a year on this program. In the space of 4 years, we reduced teenage pregnancy by over 40%. All right? And we reduced teenage abortion by over 35%. And these are dramatic numbers when you look at the cost of avoidance of, because not only is this not necessarily, again, you can't make generalizations, but the data dramatically shows that when a low-income woman has a child, and while she's still a teenager, her chances of finishing high school drop dramatically. And her chances of living a life of poverty go up. Her chances of going to prison go up. The consequences are drastic and significant. And yet, this is a program that we now have gotten through the state legislature, is now funded with public money, that demonstrates clearly that giving women access to the right information and the right support at the right time can dramatically change their lives. Currently, we've got working on a program based on the same kind of results-first approach we call Pay for Success, for at-risk youth in Colorado, using research and evaluation to make sure we are investing our funds in exactly the best place. And I think that the successes that we've seen with the teenage pregnancy, we're going to see across other arenas of the state as well. We've also looked at one of the benefits, and we've tried to analyze the benefits of having tight budget years. Because when you don't have enough money, then you really have to measure which one is going to be your priority or what gets you your benefit. And we've been very lucky. We have our chief budget officer, a guy named Henry Sobenet, who, chief budget officers are by their nature meticulous and detail-oriented. But Henry Sobenet is enlightened in that very real sense that he wants the world to be better when he leaves. And he is very passionate about how do we use data to make sure that we are getting maximum benefit for every single dollar that you use. It's always good to be a Democratic governor and have a Republican budget director. We also brought in, about 4 months ago, a woman named Donna Lynn, who is, she was the executive vice president of Kaiser Permanente, handled Kaiser operations in, I think, 5 states, ran about a $9 billion enterprise. She had worked for 4 different mayors in New York City before she went into healthcare. And my lieutenant governor stepped down, And I went to Donna, because I knew she kind of loved public service and politics, and figured that she wouldn't she wasn't going to be defining her success by how much money she could make. So anyway, I said, well, if you came in as lieutenant governor, I'll create the first position of chief operating officer for the state. And you can take all these metrics and all this measurement we're doing, and as a chief operating officer, make sure that it really is cutting down silos. And I can happily say that in 4 months, she has transformed within the cabinet, and already a couple levels down, has created an even greater excitement of what we can do with numbers when properly used. And I think, making sure that we have a culture that embraces this. Too often, you come in and you use a data-driven set of results, and too often we come out of that data-driven process without changing the employees who are using that data, without changing their culture. And then when that leadership, that governor leaves or that cabinet member moves on, those processes that revolve around data-driven discussions, those processes get thrown out along with the old leadership. I think we're making great strides to, when I ride off into the sunset in a couple of years, it's kind of sad already, that this isn't going to change, it's only going to expand and accelerate. And we are demonstrating, hopefully in every single agency, that if you use data, you're going to get results. And at a time in this country where there's great cynicism towards government, and in the end, if someone asked me, well, why did you walk away from your successful restaurant empire? You were making, we had years where I had a couple years where I made almost $1 million in a year, right? I spent the first 6 years working 60 hours a week just praying that I wouldn't, my mother wouldn't invest in the restaurant. My Aunt Jane, her sister, did. And I was just praying that I wouldn't lose my Aunt Jane's investment. And suddenly I was so rich. People ask, what made you walk away from that and go into public service? And I think, American democracy is the greatest form of government on earth, but it is also the most fragile and is dependent upon people believing in their government. And that if we're not able to begin to use facts more successfully and make sure people in the entire community, in our entire state, are aware of that, then we're putting our very form of government at risk. So you're all now hereby deputized to make sure that that happens. Thank you.
Great stuff, Governor. Thank you very much for sharing those thoughts and stories and accomplishments across the state and all the efforts that your team has made and put in place. We're going to have a little bit of Q&A. I'll kick it off with a couple of questions, but as I'm doing that and the governor is answering, please think of some questions of your own that you would like to ask the governor about what he just said and other related topics. So, Governor, one of the challenges, just picking up where you left off there, and I think many of us very much enjoyed the story about Teddy. Your son gathered
the funny thing, Teddy heard that because I used that same story just like I told it to you on public radio, talking about the gun safety and how turbulent it had become. And one of his friends, their parents played that segment online for them. They took the link, gave it to Teddy. Teddy comes home from school and says, "Hey, Dad, I hear you're using my idea." I said, "Teddy, but I gave you full credit." Teddy looked and says, "Dad, I'm not talking about credit. Do you know what the word royalty means?"
Wow.
So I pay him $1 every time I use it, and he made $1 this morning.
I think he's going to be very successful, either politician or entrepreneur and businessman. That's great. So, but interesting that he said in your comments at the end, I want to bring both the cultural change piece and what Teddy said, gather the facts, make a decision, and move on. As you well know, it's not that simple. There is a cultural change element here that does take time. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you made efforts and successful efforts to help change that culture so that there is a sustainability of this data-driven and results-oriented, outcomes-oriented approach to managing government?
So there's several ways to kind of make that more permanent. One is to create the infrastructure, the positions, the budget, so that we keep training each generation of state leadership in all our agencies about what lean principles are and how lean works. So that's part of it. But it's also about, you know, having an excitement about it at the top, and it's not just the governor, it's all the cabinet, and we talk about the importance of believing and really investing yourselves and making it fun and exciting for people. And part of it is, you know, city government, state government, there is a filter because the jobs don't pay that well, and in many cases there's a real challenge to get people that are innovative and are willing to take risks into those jobs. Yes. And too often, if you're in public service and you're facing a decision and you can pick A or B, and A, if it works, it's going to be a big deal. It's really going to change things. B, you know it's not going to change things very much, but you know there's no chance that you're going to get, it's going to be a failure. In some way, it's going to end up in the newspaper that you invested tax dollars in this thing that didn't work. And somehow we have to make it okay for state employees to fail and convince the media and the public that we're going to fail, that we're going to try things and we're going to talk about them as not experiments, but the initiatives that we're not 100% sure of, that we're doing trials, and that it is okay to fail. And you know, too often, when I first became mayor in 2003, that fall, you know, the mayor's election is in the spring, you get inaugurated in the summer, and that fall, the city of county of Denver has this huge lights, holiday lights. Season's greetings, Merry Christmas on two sides of City Hall, and people come from miles around to look at these lights. It's a big deal. And you know, I had Jewish friends who'd always said, you know, we wish that Merry Christmas would get the hell off there. The government shouldn't be. Anyway, I get in there, and all of a sudden, the public works people tell me they're going to have to replace those lights, those signs. I thought, well, this is a pretty good opportunity. So, seasons, happy holidays, seasons greetings. You know, and I thought, great, it's not going to cost us a penny. And one of the local newspapers hears about it from somebody in Public Works who wasn't very happy. And they call up, and I said, sure, yeah, it's not going to cost us $1. And the whole city is going to be more embracing of all our citizens. Isn't that great? Next day, it's on the front page of the Denver Post. All the talk radios are saying, you know, Hickenlooper hates Christmas. Hickenlooper's anti-Christian. Hickenlooper's anti-Santa Claus. And I sat there, and I got my senior staff together, and I said, you know, we're trying to deal with homelessness, right? We've got the worst budget cuts that anyone's had to make in the history of the city. How do we can't be distracted by this. And they said, well, if you go and say you made a mistake, the office of the mayor will be diluted. You can't admit that you've made mistakes. I said, I can. No, I mean, if we're worried about me admitting to making mistakes, that horse is out of the barn. Right? In the private sector, I was well known for great things that worked and some things that didn't work so well. So I went on the first talk radio, and you know, they couldn't believe that I was on. I said, no, this is the mayor. And I just want to know we're going to go 180 degrees. We're going to put the new sign's going to say Merry Christmas, Season's Greetings, or Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays. And he goes, really? Are you serious? And actually, my communications director, Lindy Eichenbaum-Lent, gave me the line. I said, well, just because there are two O's in Hickenlooper doesn't make me Scrooge. But anyway, so not only did it not dilute, there was such an appetite in the media and among the public for a public official just to say, I screwed up, right? I'm not going to do it again. Here's what I thought. Here's why I did it. Here's what I thought I was doing. And we heard about it from the rank and file city workers, that they somehow felt, you know, invigorated and in a funny way, a sense of freedom, that they also didn't have to conform to that sense of perfection that sometimes we invest in our public officials.
It's a great point. It's a great point. You know, you've worked in the private sector. You've been an entrepreneur. The watchword and the approach nowadays in certain elements of the private sector is if you're going to fail, which is inevitable, fail fast and continue to make improvements. Does that apply here in government? Is that basically one of the tenets that you're espousing?
Yes, absolutely. I think fail and fail small.
Yes.
In the entrepreneurship world, sometimes they say fail big because they think you'll learn more that way. We are trying to be very careful, like with the teenage pregnancy, to use philanthropic dollars for the high-risk initiatives. And that's one of the reasons that organizations like Pew are so valuable, that there are a number of foundations that will allow a city or a state to try a new initiative. And you know, if it fails and it's philanthropic dollars, the public is much more forgiving. And I think that's a key. But even when you've tried something, sometimes you put it in a different context or roll it out at scale, and it doesn't work. And you've got to be willing to say quickly, no, I mean, the days of when you defend it and ride it all the way to the bottom, those days are over. I mean, I think you've got to just acknowledge, own up to the mistake, explain why you think this mistake occurred and how you're going to fix it.
Right. Great point. Questions from the audience, perhaps? Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Eric Sabine with Colorado DOT, and
Thank you.
It's on mute.
Keep.
You said Colorado Department of Transportation?
I think it's working. We'll see.
Yes, you're
with
good.
Colorado Department of Transportation. My question concerns essentially open data initiatives, and I know that's a subject that's of great interest to many people. Without naming any names, obviously, I'm going through a battle right now on this topic, and it feels like sometimes we have to fight these battles down in the trenches, one data set and one person at a time, and that's a very slow way to proceed. And so I'm sitting here thinking, is there some bad guy I can point to where when I'm dealing with one of these situations, I can say, I'd like to be flexible and go with the way that you want to do things, but that darn governor or something will, you know, is forcing us to open up and give this data out. And so I'm wondering if you have some thoughts about how we can start to, you know, not fight these one data set at a time, which is so slow.
So that is a great question, and I'm happy to be the fall guy. I mean, and it is, I mean, we look at all the WikiLeaks, right? I mean, data is becoming transparent whether we like it or not. And we've been saying this since I was mayor to everyone, you know, on your private email, your business email, whatever. Don't trash talk people, don't make fun of people. Imagine that your kid, what we say is imagine your kid's going to be able to see your emails at the end of the day, or imagine that it's going to be on the front page of the Denver Post, right? Just assume that everything you're doing is going to be transparent. And if you are doing something that you're worried about, and I know that the Department of Transportation funding is one of the most contentious issues in state government. I mean, the passion of local communities is, I couldn't believe it when I'd only seen it from, as the mayor of Denver, you know, being frustrated sometimes that we couldn't get the real criteria, how decisions were made, or that we didn't think we were getting our fair share. Now I see that it's every community is besieging the Department of Transportation at a level. And I think we're going to have to be more and more transparent. I don't think there's any way to back away from that trend. So blame it on the governor. Say that I absolutely insist. And we're going to eventually, and it's going to take changing culture, but our goal is to get every important data set for every state agency online. And that saves you a tremendous amount of those discussions with staff saying, hey, this is just going to upset people. I'll tell you one interesting example. When I think I've been mayor for about 3 years, and each year we would get our crime statistics about 4 months after the end of the year. I said, well, is this stuff on computers? How come it takes us so long? And they said, well, it used to take, we had to go through all the paperwork in the old days, but yeah, now we can sum it up pretty quickly. I said, well, why don't we get it out to the public sooner? And I won't name names, but a very wise, sophisticated leader put their arm around me and said, Mr. Mayor, you don't want that. Because every time we release these crime statistics, those neighborhoods that have seen their crime go up are furious, and they want more police officers in their district, and they are really upset at the fact that some other neighborhoods are getting more police officers, and yet their crime hasn't gone up. And it just creates a couple of months of storms, just the way it is now after we let it simmer down for 4 months. If we put this data up, you know, in January right afterwards, all hell would break loose. So I thought about that for a day. I called the meeting back. I said, you know what? Let's go the other way. Let's start putting our crime statistics up every 2 weeks, right? And let's invite every neighborhood to see where our police officers are. Let's give that mapping where we're putting our police officers. You know, I'd read about Bill Bratton in New York and this notion of taking that information and letting the public see. Maybe that'll make neighborhoods pay attention more. Most people aren't going to look at the website, but most neighborhoods will have one activist that's going to look at it and talk to their neighbors and get people fired up about the crime statistics in their neighborhood. I said, is that really going to be a bad thing if all of our neighborhoods are all focused on crime and paying attention to the information in real time? And the head of public safety and the chief of police and everyone said, well, but you're not. And they didn't have it. I mean, we sat about it. I will say that we had another couple meetings before we made the final decision. And they were right. It did create we did eventually do it, and it did create a real firestorm for a while of people really getting agitated. Community, neighborhood activists are impassioned, and for very good reason oftentimes. But once it settled down after a few months, the police department would have to be more responsive to the neighborhoods, and without question, the neighborhoods became much more involved in community policing, and we saw our crime go down. I mean, there's no question. 6 months after we did this, we saw the crime was already going down a little, but that curve clearly inflected.
Well, and it's a great sign of your leadership, and just to highlight the fact that you recognize that you did need to have more conversations with people in order to make this change happen, and it was that kind of insertion of your own time and energy and commitment that must have turned the tide, quite frankly. So it's that's a piece of this whole cultural change that I think we're talking about. We see it in other states, and you've certainly exemplified it here.
I should say that the head of public safety, Al LaCabe, who had come, African-American guy who'd grown up in a rough section of New Orleans and had been a police officer many years himself, then gotten a law degree. He worked in the U.S. Attorney's Office, one very smart guy, and he really didn't. He got it pretty quickly. The police chief was a little slower to win over.
Got it.
I made it sound like everybody was against me. Dramatic effect, not true.
Other questions? I certainly have another question. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Tim Howell, Dell EMC. Good seeing you again.
You bet.
So my question, sorry, that's okay. My question is, and we've talked about this before, is how important is the public-private partnership in driving government into the 21st century? One of the biggest things that we notice as a private company is that government is kind of lags behind the overall winds of change with technology. I just wanted to kind of ask you, one, how do you kind of grade the importance of the public-private partnership? And then more importantly is what efforts is government doing and taking the steps to retain the talent and educate internal talent to keep up with the private sector? Sure.
Well, and we have had this discussion, Tim, and as you know, I couldn't agree more that the public-private partnerships are important for three reasons. One, you bring the public-private partnership to the fore, and you show it helps reassure the public that it's not just government, that there is an injection of common sense often from the private sector in there. It's also very important to the workforce of the state to be working with people that are from different backgrounds, bring a different approach to the problems, look at data in a whole different way. Very, very valuable. That kind of, in the restaurant business, we always used to put the bar stools closer to the high top tables in the bar area so that people on a busy night, they'd kind of brush against people as they walk by. My restaurant designer called that friendly friction. And I think friendly friction is what we get also when we do these public-private partnerships. They also allow us to, in many cases, do more with less tax dollars at first. And then we can scale up as we begin through a partnership. As we scale up that relationship, we can be more successful and not kind of get caught off on a sidetrack in some way.
Great. Governor, when you were the head of the National Governors Association, you traveled around the country as an ambassador for data-driven decision-making to achieve better outcomes for citizens. What did you hear, and you're also a very good listener, what did you hear and learn from some of the other governors and the successes that they were achieving in this data-driven approach?
Well, it was great, and anytime you do this with governors, and it's interesting, in this time of dysfunction in Washington, governors continue to work together at a level that you really don't see in state legislatures or in Washington as much, which are more partisan driven. Governors, it's kind of where the buck stops. You got to make a decision. So Republicans and Democrats generally will roll up their sleeves and work together. I just had lunch yesterday up in Wyoming with Governor Matt Mead. We were both on the same panel. And we had a whole list of 5 different things we're working on. There's never a question of gotcha or trying to make the other guy look bad. We're just trying to make things work better. And as I went around, so when I was the chair of the National Governors Association, my initiative was called Delivering Results. And it was looking at every different way we can, how do we begin making data-driven policy a part of the DNA of this country? And it was great. You look at some of these states like Utah, Governor Gary Herbert, all over it. I mean, really gets it. Martin O'Malley in Maryland was really one of the pioneers in trying to find new ways of using data like this. Governor Snyder in Michigan, all you ever hear about is Flint and the water. But if you look at what he's done for the state structure, I think it's really a shame that that he's gotten so tarnished by one. Clearly, I'm not defending anything that happened in Flint, but he transformed many parts of the state government into using data and being more aggressive in terms of using what that data tells you. California has, in many ways in the last decade, transformed the way they approach issues and solutions by using data. It was really inspiring to see that it's not a complete frontier as sometimes people think it is. We have a challenge in government, the funding. Again and again and again, if there's a budget downturn, right, if there's a recession and all of a sudden funding goes away, just the culture of state government means that the first place you begin to cut is capital spending. So that's why so often the buildings, if the roof's not leaking, it's about to, right? And that technology project that you're investing in that is often a real catalyst for, changing an approach to how you do things. It's an ability to gather more data, to make better decisions. That funding for the technology, whether it's software or whatever, all of a sudden it gets stalled, or the new project doesn't get funded. Those are the places we cut first because no one wants to lay anybody off.
Right.
And that's a very difficult culture, and we're going through that. We're doing the budget for the state right now, and we are going to have some shrinkages. Luckily, the nice thing, what I always told people at the city when I was mayor, and I say the same thing in the state, so many baby boomers are retiring now that this is a great time to use data and technology and to try and deliver more services to people with less personnel. In other words, using technology, you can get more done with less people without ever having to lay anyone off because there's so many people retiring and stepping down. It takes a lot of that edge off of shrinking the...
Change.
Yeah, it's changed.
Yes.
By 7 years, I was mayor for 7.5 years of Denver, and we ended up with 7% fewer employees than when I got there. It's the first time in the history of the city that anyone had ever really focused on that and made the workforce smaller.
But perhaps more productive and more efficient.
I think much
Sounds
more
like it.
much more efficient.
Yeah, it's great. We have time for one last question, and I'm sorry, now we have a whole bunch of hands up.
You shouldn't have waited.
So yes, right here in the front. We may be able to sneak in two if it's quick.
If the governor can be concise.
Margaret Miller from Chapa. Do you have any plans, or are you already partnering with educational, high school through college, to have students access this data and play with it?
Well, we have talked about it. We have like one pilot that we're talking about. We haven't done it yet, but it's good that you're saying that because this is exactly the time of year when I need to reinvigorate that kind of an initiative. And that's a great idea to kind of spread that. It's amazing to me that roughly 40% of the people in America don't believe in evolution, right? Which, as a geologist, the facts for evolution are so powerful. And again, I'm the first to say, I don't understand how you explain the beginning of it all, right? I'm all into God, right? There's some all-powerful being there, but evolution, it's hard you can argue with evolution, yet huge chunks, and that starts with the kids.
Right. Another question. Yes, sir, right on the edge. Yes.
Governor John Gottsagen, I'm the Chief Data Officer within OIT now. And among the various things that have been brought up, or various other things, it seems to be one of the issues is the way the federal government behaves, so to speak, the way federal funding works and the programs work, and how they limit or kind of create siloing among state agencies that implement those programs. So I'm wondering if you and other governors have had that interaction with federal agencies about that.
Yeah, and that is another great question because it's true. And there are a lot of cultural reasons why that's happened and why it continues to happen. President Obama, so Governor Herbert and I had a 45-minute meeting with President Obama about 1.5 years ago. And he could not be more receptive. He really is geek in chief. He may be a Harvard lawyer, he's editor of the Harvard Law Review. I mean, he's one of the top lawyers you could ever happen. But he loves technology. He gets it. He understands the the backup on it. And he's been doing what he's really been pushing to try and change a lot of those attitudes. But the culture is so big, and no one ever has gone in and really tried to address these and they're more than inclinations. They're patterns of behavior that are so deeply ingrained. It's like some of those roads in England. If you look at how deep they are, it's because they're Roman roads. Those roads have been used since for several thousand years. It's the same pattern. I think. Well, we'll see what happens. Part of it is that we've had occasional presidents that really don't believe in government, and in the process of trying to make it smaller, just kind of throw up their hands at the operational nature of it. And I think, to a certain extent, Al Gore, when he was vice president, he became, for about 3.5 years, really focused on the operational side of the federal government and things like how do you get technology out. But I will say that Obama's got I think it's about 200 people, you probably know better than I, in his technology. He calls them the roughnecks, but they're trying to use business processes by which they analyze what software to get and what software would be most beneficial to all the states, and then how to help in the procurement, making sure that procurement is done properly. It certainly hasn't trickled down to what we see. And at some point, the presidents get caught up in legacies and big visions, and they need a chief operating officer. They need someone every day who's going to wake up in the morning and is going to have authority to really go out and say, all right, we're going to change government, we're going to make it a little smaller, but we're going to make it do better, and we're going to get people to believe in government again. And it might be one of the two candidates that are running. I realize this is a nonprofit, and I'm not going to make any political suggestions.
Well, maybe that is exactly one of the priorities of the next president's. Great advice, whoever wins. So thank you very much, Governor. Really appreciate you coming in today.
Thanks very much. Thank you all.